She just wanted to deposit a check. But the way they looked at her like a thief ended up exposing an entire system. This is the story of a 76-year-old Black woman, quiet, composed, not one to fight with words, but with the dignity of someone who has spent her whole life refusing to shrink. On a seemingly ordinary morning, she walked into her local bank to deposit a government-issued check. But instead of being welcomed like any longtime customer, she was humiliated, interrogated because of how she looked. What no one in that room realized was that her son was the CEO of the entire banking institution. And when he walked through the doors, everything changed. But this wasn't just a personal reckoning. It became a national moment, one that forced a powerful industry to finally take a hard look at itself. Monterey Ridge was the kind of town that believed in politeness more than progress. A place where everyone knew your name, but not your truth. Where bank tellers smiled with thin lips and thick filters. Where older Black women like Martha Ellison learned long ago that being calm wasn't just dignified, it was necessary. On that particular Wednesday morning, the air was mild and the sky clean, the kind of weather that felt like nothing could go wrong. Martha walked to Cascade Union Bank like she always did. Alone, steady, head high, she wore her dark green coat, her best low-heeled shoes, and a pin of a silver dove on her collar. She didn't walk with a cane because she needed to. She walked with it because it bought her space, respect, time. In her purse was a government-issued, check-a-delayed, pandemic-era compensation for retired frontline healthcare workers. She had earned every cent of it through years of tending to the sick, watching people die alone, and staying silent when policies failed, and people pretended not to notice. But today wasn't about reflection. It was about depositing a check. Inside the bank, something felt off. The staff had changed. The plants were fake now, the smiles thinner. The woman at the front desk barely looked up. The teller, a young white woman, maybe 22, stiffened when Martha handed her the check. There was a flicker of discomfort and then the usual phrase, "One moment, please." Moments later, the manager arrived. Alicia Monroe. Blazer too stiff, smile too tight. The kind of woman who had learned authority before empathy. She examined the check, then Martha's ID, then the check again. "This is a large amount," she said, voice polite but flat. "Can you explain where it came from?" Martha replied evenly. "Federal pandemic compensation. I was a nurse for 43 years. Alicia didn't nod, didn't blink. "Do you mind stepping into the back with me so we can verify this properly?" "I'd prefer to handle it here," Martha answered. Alicia's lips thinned. "Ma'am, if you're not willing to cooperate, we'll have to place a hold on the funds and report it for further review." That's when the room shifted. Customers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. A man lowered his phone. A woman stiffened in line. Martha didn't raise her voice. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I'll call my son," she said. Alicia snorted. "Calling your son won't change our protocol." Martha pressed the dial anyway. "Brandon, I'm at the Cascade branch. Yes, again. Her name is Alicia." She ended the call and slid the phone away. "He's on his way," she said. 15 minutes later, the doors opened. Brandon Ellison didn't need an introduction. Dark suit, no tie, quiet authority in his stride. He walked past the security guard, past the line, and straight to his mother. "Hi, Mama," he said. "Hey, baby," she replied. Then he turned to Alicia. "Is there a problem with my mother's account?" Alicia froze. "Who are you?" "Brandon Ellison, CEO, Cascade Financial Holdings." Silence detonated in the lobby. Customers turned. Staff stiffened. Alicia blanched. You questioned her. Refused to process a verified check. Escalated a situation with a long-standing customer in front of an entire room. I helped write the very procedures you claim to be following." Alicia stammered something about fraud protocols. Brandon cut her off. "No, what you did wasn't protocol. It was prejudice." He stepped behind the counter, entered his credentials, and processed the deposit himself. When the receipt printed, he handed it to Martha without a word. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," he replied. Then he turned to Alicia. "You just made a very public mistake, and you're about to find out what accountability looks like." That evening, a customer posted a clip from the incident online. No faces, but clear audio, clear context. By morning, it had gone viral, a grandmother humiliated, a son stepping in, a system exposed, and Monterey Ridge was no longer silent. By the next morning, the video had circled the internet 3 times over. It wasn't polished. It wasn't narrated. It didn't need to be. The soundbite that caught fire wasn't Brandon's calm authority or Alicia's bluster. It was Martha's voice, low and controlled, asking a simple question. Do I look like I'm raising my voice? It echoed like a match against dry wood. Suddenly, the bank's polished corporate image couldn't keep up with the public's appetite for truth. Within hours, hashtags appeared. Banking while black and Ellison effect. Her name is Martha. By noon, local reporters were camped outside Cascade Union's headquarters in Portland, seeking comment. Brandon didn't speak. He didn't need to. The clip spoke for itself. Inside the Monterey Ridge branch, things were less digital and more personal. Alicia Monroe hadn't returned to the front desk. Rumor said she had been called in to meet with regional leadership, but no one had seen her since. Some employees said she was misunderstood. Others, like Minh Tran, a young Vietnamese-American teller who had only worked there 6 months, said nothing at all. He had seen the exchange. He had heard the condescension in Alicia's tone. He had looked at Martha's face and seen the quiet ache of someone who had carried this kind of insult before, but he also saw something different, something unflinching. That stayed with him. At home, Martha sat at her kitchen table, the same one she had bought with her late husband decades ago, sipping tea as if nothing had changed, except something had. For years, she had taught herself to let things slide, to keep her dignity by avoiding unnecessary confrontation. But dignity, she realized, wasn't the same as silence. Dignity didn't mean shrinking so others could feel tall. She hadn't planned to become a symbol. She had planned to deposit a check. And yet here she was, her name whispered in reverence, her story dissected on air. What struck her most was the number of messages she had received. Former patients, former colleagues, strangers, all with the same theme. Thank you for standing up. The irony, of course, was that she never stood up. She simply stayed still. Everyone else had been too used to looking away. By the end of the week, Cascade Union issued a formal statement. It was the kind of thing only lawyers could love neutral language. No direct apology, a commitment to review procedures, and ensure all customers feel welcome. It satisfied no one, and that was when Brandon knew the institution he led was moving too slowly for the world that had finally started moving fast. He didn't want to be a crisis manager. He wanted to be a change maker. But change wasn't boardroom safe. It cost things reputation, allies, comfort. In a private conversation with the executive team, Brandon floated an idea. Listening circles. A public forum where longtime customers could share their experiences directly with bank leadership. No cameras, no press, just truth. Unsurprisingly, most of the board hated it. It makes us look weak, Meredith Shaw had said, her tone clipped. It makes us look human, Brandon had replied. He had already picked a location, the Civic Center in Monterey Ridge. Neutral ground, familiar walls. And he had already picked the first speaker, though she didn't know it yet. Martha was skeptical when he brought it up. You want me to stand in front of a room full of strangers and retell something I've spent my whole life trying to rise above? Brandon met her gaze without blinking. I want them to understand what it means when someone like you walks into a room and is treated like she doesn't belong. She didn't answer at first, but the next day she called him back. Fine, she said, but I won't perform, I'll just speak. That's all I'm asking, Sassohai said. The Monterey Ridge Civic Center hadn't seen this many folding chairs filled since the mayor's dog got elected honorary mascot in 2014. But tonight was different. People came not for a spectacle, but for a reckoning. The room was warm with body heat, anticipation, and the heavy quiet that comes when truth is expected but not yet spoken. There were no cameras, no sponsors, no prepared speeches. Just paper name tags, a few pitchers of water, and a semicircle of seats facing a modest platform. Brandon stood at the back, arms crossed, eyes sharp but unreadable. He didn't want to lead this. He wanted to witness it. When Martha walked up to the front, no one clapped. They just watched. That felt better. Clapping could be dismissed. Stillness couldn't. She adjusted the microphone slightly, cleared her throat once, and began. I'm not here to relive what happened at the bank. I'm here because it didn't surprise me. A low murmur passed through the room. What happened to me has happened to too many people who didn't have a CEO for a son. The only difference is that mine walked through the door. Most just walk away, quietly. She let the pause settle. We've been trained to make ourselves smaller, to smile through suspicion, to apologize for making people uncomfortable just by existing in spaces they don't expect us to be in. That's not professionalism. That's survival, and I'm tired of surviving in places I've earned the right to belong. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. There was a strength in her restraint, a kind of emotional architecture that only comes from decades of swallowing words and choosing which ones to let out like needles. So this isn't about revenge. This is about repair. You can't apologize away a pattern. You can only interrupt it. When she stepped back, the room didn't erupt. It breathed. Deep, collective, like a pressure valve, finally turned loose. What followed was unplanned. One by one, people stood and spoke. An elderly Korean grocer who was denied a business loan 3 times. A Latino war veteran whose cashier's checks were flagged every month. A white woman whose biracial daughter was told by a teller that she must be adopted. Each story landed like a stone dropped in the same pond. The ripples connected. Brandon stayed silent through it all, but inside him, something cracked open. This wasn't a brand problem. It was a cultural infection. And he wasn't sure the institution he ran had the immune system to survive the cure. The next morning, media coverage exploded, not because the bank orchestrated a campaign, but because someone had recorded Martha's speech on their phone and uploaded it with a single caption. She didn't ask for power, she just refused to give hers away. In under 24 hours, the clip reached 2 million views. Editorials followed, national news called, emails flooded the board's inboxes, customers threatened to leave, but more than anything else, stories poured in, too many to count. Some heartbreaking, some infuriating, all familiar. At Cascade's Portland headquarters, the mood shifted. Words like brand damage, public perception, and board confidence began circulating like pollen in spring. The executive team requested an emergency meeting with Brandon. He walked in knowing exactly what they would say before any of them opened their mouths. We appreciate your leadership, Meredith Shaw began, with the grace of someone trained to fire people without raising her blood pressure. But it's clear that your direction is creating turbulence. Brandon nodded once. So was slavery. Turbulence isn't the issue. Injustice is. No one laughed. Charles Park, head of compliance, tried a different angle. We're receiving calls from investors. They're asking for clarity on the chain of command. There's concern you're using your position to pursue a personal agenda. Brandon leaned forward, folding his hands slowly. I don't have a personal agenda. I have a moral one. And if the board finds those things incompatible, then we're having the wrong conversation. That sentence stayed in the room long after the meeting ended. Not because it was loud, but because it was unignorable. Brandon didn't storm out. He didn't need to. The storm was already gathering, and everyone knew where it was heading. The storm didn't arrive as thunder. It arrived as questions. Questions from media outlets, from advocacy groups, from customers who had been loyal to Cascade for years and were suddenly wondering if that loyalty had been misplaced. Questions from regulators, from quiet allies, and most of all, from within. Brandon stood at the center of it all, not as a symbol of power, but as the fulcrum between two truths. The institution he led was hemorrhaging trust, and the world around it was no longer willing to be polite about pain. Across town, Martha's phone rang 3 times before she stopped picking up. Journalists, producers, activists, all wanting a quote, a moment, a soundbite. She gave none. She didn't speak to amplify the noise. She had spoken to unearth something buried, and now that it was exposed, she let the country see it without polishing the edges. She sat quietly with Luca and Min at her kitchen table, reading through messages from strangers, letters handwritten, and emails typed in rage or gratitude from grandmothers, students, single mothers, veterans, immigrants. Every one of them had a version of her story, some softer, some worse, but all real, She didn't answer them all. She didn't have to. Her silence now wasn't the kind used to disappear. It was the kind used to listen. At Cascade headquarters, the board scrambled to contain the fallout. PR firms were called, internal task forces were formed. A crisis manager from New York arrived with binders full of recommended messaging strategies and smile-tested phrases like healing trust and reaffirming commitment. Brandon sat through one of those sessions, unmoved. He didn't want a strategy. He wanted truth. "We need to be first in defining the narrative," Meredith Shaw insisted, "before it defines us." "It already has," Brandon replied. "We're not in charge of the story anymore. We're just characters in it." Some execs looked uncomfortable. Others looked scared. Charles Park, ever the tactician, suggested they float the idea of Brandon taking a sabbatical time to reflect, he called it. Brandon didn't laugh. "You want me to disappear quietly so you can return to business as usual. But business as usual is exactly the problem." The room fell still. There was no rebuttal, just shifting eyes and the heavy awareness that something was breaking, not because of noise, but because of truth. The second listening circle was held in Portland. A larger space, better lighting, and a line of people waiting to get in before the doors even opened. Martha had refused to speak at this one. "I've said what needed saying," she told Brandon. "Let others carry it now." And they did. A woman from Eugene shared how her father was denied a loan despite a perfect credit score. A Black teacher spoke of being told her salary didn't qualify her for anything more than a starter account. A Burmese immigrant who barely spoke English used a translator to explain how the bank smiled but stalled every time he tried to open an account. Each voice wasn't an accusation, it was a wound made visible. Brandon sat among them, not at the front, not on stage, just among them. And when the room went quiet, he stood and said one thing: "Thank you for not staying quiet. I'll make sure someone hears this beyond these walls." No applause followed, but he saw it in their faces, the quiet shift of someone who believed him. But belief wasn't enough for everyone. Investors started pulling out of exploratory talks. A competitor bank issued a vague statement about commitment to neutrality, which was widely read as a jab at Cascade. A whisper campaign emerged, questioning Brandon's leadership, his objectivity, even his professionalism. "He's too emotional," one anonymous source said in an industry blog. "Too reactive," said another. Inside the company, fissures widened. Some department heads aligned behind Brandon's vision. Others fell silent or disappeared into strategic ambiguity. But the pressure was mounting, and it was mounting fast. One afternoon, Brandon walked into his office to find a sealed envelope on his desk, no return address, no title, just his name. Inside was a letter typed in 12-point font, a formal request from a majority of board members for him to consider succession planning for the health and continuity of leadership. No signature, no phone call, just ink. Brandon read it once, then again, and then placed it face down without a word. He didn't resign. He didn't rage. Instead, he called Min. "You still working nights?" Brandon asked. "Yeah," Min said. "But I've been thinking about leaving." Brandon paused. "What would you do instead?" Min hesitated. "Maybe work somewhere that doesn't make me question who I am every day." Brandon nodded slowly. "Then let me ask you something harder. Would you meet with Alicia?" Min blinked. "What? Why?" "Because systems don't change with firings. They change with confrontations." Min exhaled. "I'll think about it." Brandon didn't push. He just said, "I'll be here when you decide." That night, Martha turned down a TV interview request. She said no to a magazine profile. She ignored a literary agent's pitch for a memoir. When Luca asked why, Martha replied, "I'm not the point. The point is that this isn't rare. It's just filmed now." Then she walked outside, stood on her porch, and looked up at the stars. There were fewer than she remembered, but the ones that stayed still shimmered. That was enough. The board didn't fire Brandon outright. They weren't that bold or that foolish. Instead, they requested an emergency executive session under the guise of strategic reorganization. The language was vague, but the tone was sharp. When Brandon entered the room, every chair was filled, every laptop open, every smile rehearsed. Meredith Shaw, flanked by Charles Park and two outside consultants, led the charge. We appreciate your continued dedication, Brandon, she began, her voice smooth, sterile, carefully devoid of emotion. But the current climate is unsustainable. Investor confidence is unstable. Public attention is drifting into volatility. We believe, for the sake of continuity, a leadership transition may be necessary. Brandon didn't flinch. You mean, step aside, quietly, to restore the illusion of neutrality. Charles coughed into his fist. We'd offer a full severance package. Legacy protections, a consulting title. This doesn't have to be hostile. Brandon nodded slowly. It's not hostile, it's predictable. Then he stood. Let me save you the paperwork. I won't play mascot for a system that refuses to confront its own reflection. With that, he walked out. No one followed. But by that point, he wasn't leading a company. He was lighting a fuse. Outside, the news caught wind within hours. Cascade CEO steps down amid inclusion controversy. Ellison leaves post as bank faces ongoing public scrutiny. The headlines were wrong, but not unexpected. Brandon didn't give interviews. He gave something more: dangerous clarity. On his personal page, he posted one line: neutrality has never been a synonym for justice. It was shared over 100,000 times in less than a day. Meanwhile, Martha received an invitation she never expected: a request to speak at the State Forum on Ethics and Equity in Government and Corporate Practice. The email came from a senior advisor to the governor. The message was respectful, straightforward, and came with one condition. We kindly ask that you refrain from referencing Cascade Union Bank by name. Martha read it twice, then set it down without answering. She went to her garden instead, clipped a few sprigs of rosemary, and returned to her kitchen. She didn't need a microphone to be heard, but if they were handing her one, she would use it. Brandon called her that evening. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, she replied, but I want to. Even if they try to cut you off, then I'll speak faster. He didn't argue. He knew better. On the day of the forum, Martha walked onto the stage wearing the same green coat she had worn that morning at the bank. No stylist, no media coach, just herself. When she reached the podium, the crowd fell still. She didn't smile. She didn't perform. She simply began. They told me not to mention names, so I won't. But let me say this plainly. When you walk into a room and people assume you don't belong, the insult isn't in the words. It's in the certainty. In the way they look past you, question you, diminish you, and then tell you to calm down when you react. A few people shifted uncomfortably. She continued, this isn't about one bank, one manager, one clip. It's about the scaffolding of assumption that wraps around every desk, every loan, every meeting, every nod. It's about the kind of professionalism that's really just rehearsed bias. She paused, looked across the room. If your institution can only function when people stay quiet about mistreatment, then it was never a place of integrity. It was a place of performance. Her final words were clear. You asked me not to name names, but the silence you requested speaks louder than any name I could give. She left the stage to stunned silence. Then, slowly, the room stood not for applause, but because no one wanted to be caught sitting down when history walked past them. The clip of her speech, of course, went viral again. But this time, something shifted. It wasn't just shared, it was felt. News anchors quoted her without edits. Influencers replayed the last line. Even officials who disagreed with her privately admitted the power of her presence. A quiet woman with no media training had said what no CEO, no politician, no consultant could say without risking their job. She had risked nothing because she had nothing left to prove. Back in Monterey Ridge, Martha returned to her routines: church, gardening, tea. But something in the town had changed. Strangers nodded with more intention. Store clerks didn't call her sweetie anymore, they called her Mrs. Ellison. Not because of fear, but because of recognition. It wasn't reverence. It was acknowledgement. That was all she had ever wanted. Brandon didn't return to finance. He declined multiple offers. Instead, he began teaching part-time guest lectures on ethics and systems, power, and silence. He never used slides. He asked questions instead. Hard ones. ones that couldn't be answered without confronting the world you came from. One of his favorites was this: "What do you do when fairness makes people uncomfortable?" Then he'd watch the room go quiet, just like it had in that lobby, just like it had in the boardroom, just like it would again. The wind was gentle the morning Martha returned to a bank. Not the same branch, not the same system, but the same kind of building. Red bricks, wide windows, clean floors, neutral colors, meant to reassure without saying too much. She wasn't here for a fight. She wasn't here for a deposit. She had a small check to cash, a refund from the electric company. Nothing remarkable, nothing headline-worthy. That was exactly the point. She stepped into the lobby and immediately noticed what had changed. The welcome was still corporate, still practiced, but not forced. A young teller looked up, met her eyes directly, and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison. How can I help you today?" Martha nodded once, handed over her ID and check, and waited. No one asked where the money came from. No one questioned her tone or her right to be there. The teller printed the receipt, slid it across the counter, and said, "Thank you for trusting us." Martha paused, then answered softly but clearly, "I don't trust Easy anymore, but I pay attention." She folded the slip, tucked it into her purse, and walked out, calm, deliberate, with her back straight and her presence impossible to miss. No one applauded, no one filmed. But the difference was real. The weight of being seen didn't need a witness, just space to exist. Across the state, Brandon stood in front of a small lecture hall filled with college seniors studying organizational leadership. He wore a navy sweater, not a suit, and his notes were handwritten, not typed. He talked about power not as a force to wield, but as a weight to carry. He didn't reference Cascade by name. He didn't need to. When a student asked what leadership meant to him now, after everything, Brandon paused, then said, "It means being willing to lose your position to protect your people. And it means knowing the difference between peace and permission." The room went silent in the best way, the kind that signals real thinking. Not performance, not fear, just thought. That was all he wanted to leave behind. Luca's nonprofit, seen and heard, quietly grew. No big launch, no PR campaign, just a space in a shared building and a stack of cases from people who had stopped believing fairness was an option. Min eventually joined her, leaving banking entirely. He designed a financial literacy program for undocumented immigrants. Their mission wasn't revolution, it was repair, and that was harder. But it held. Martha never gave another major speech. She didn't need to. The words she had already said continued to live beyond her, quoted on posters, replayed in trainings, whispered in hallways where people finally understood the cost of being overlooked. She continued her routines. She brewed tea. She tended her garden. She mentored 3 young girls from the neighborhood, not with lessons, but with time. They watched how she moved, how she spoke, how she listened. One of them, after asking what happened that day in the bank, heard the whole story in silence. Then she said, "You didn't yell?" And Martha smiled. "I didn't have to. I already knew who I was." 1 year later, a new mural appeared on the side of a community center in Portland. It wasn't flashy, just a painted figure of a woman in a green coat, cane in one hand, receipt in the other. The caption read, "Respect is not a favor, it's the floor." Martha never visited it. She didn't need to see herself on a wall. She was still walking through neighborhoods, still offering the kind of presence that couldn't be erased. Her legacy wasn't in interviews or awards. It was in the silence that followed her, not the kind meant to erase, but the kind born from awe, from recognition, from knowing someone had changed something, not by overpowering the system, but by refusing to be made small inside it. And that was the end of it. No parades, no fanfare, just a story passed between people who understood its weight. A woman stepped into a bank. She was underestimated. She was challenged. She was met with disrespect. And when the system expected her to back down, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. Her son didn't defend her to protect her honor. He upheld it because she had never lost it. The world watched. The world responded. And then it kept going. A little sharper, a little more aware. Justice didn't come like a gavel. It came like a shift in the air. Quiet, permanent, true.